really could run into trouble. The lack of trust is really perhaps the most problematic. Companies, businesses get a reputation for having poor security, and that reputation, even if it's unfounded, is really hard to shake. I think about SolarWinds was in the news, right? SolarWinds had a supply chain problem, which meant one of the applications that they used in their environment was broken, had a vulnerability. This allowed people into their environment. They lost massive amounts of trust. Now, certainly, there were other risks too. They had to spend $30, $35 million getting themselves out of that problem. Huge reputational problems are gonna dog them for years. It doesn't always need to be the case. How do you solve for security? Frankly, security is not a solvable problem. There is no answer that gets you to a victory. There's no victory condition for security. It is always a persistent struggle against evolving threats. Your maturity of your program, the key indicator of its success isn't that you're winning. The key indicator is that you're maturing slightly faster than the people who are coming after you. Your technology is keeping up. It doesn't need to be cutting edge, ultra modern with lots of fancy tools, but it needs to be keeping pace with risks as they evolve. This is one model for describing a security program. And I encourage everybody who's thinking about building out a program in a shop to look at the cybersecurity framework. So the NIST CSF framework is in use by a wide variety. Most of the companies on the Fortune 1000 will use this in some capacity. This defines the language of security. It lets you talk about it, ask questions, it lets you Google search effectively, just to be really simple about it. It's breaking things down into these categories. How do you identify what you have, all your assets, all your risks? How do you protect them? What safeguards do you put in place that can block access or mitigate risk? How do you detect gaps in that? How do you detect an alert? How do you detect an event? If somebody is trying to, say, send a lot of traffic to your web front end or one of your applications, how do you detect that and block it? How do you respond in the case of an incident? Now, this could be an incident that's partway through and you've detected it, you're not really sure what's happening, or it could be, we've had an incident, we've lost some data. We lost a file that contained these email addresses and this personal information. Now we need to dig in, remediate, and start to fix it. And then recovery. Recovery is, how do you get back to a whole state? And this could be, on one hand, disaster recovery, rolling to backups, getting back to your data. It could be just an internal resilience in your business that says, we're going to be operating at 70% capacity within IT for the next 3 months as we work on this issue, but we have runbooks, we have plans, we know what we're doing. We talked about compliance drivers. Many of you have this. Definitely, when we get to questions, feel free to bring up any framers you have. These kinds of things can be great in that they help you motivate your own internal leadership teams. They help you get the juice you need to get a program up and running, perhaps to dedicate resources to it, but definitely to dedicate time and thought to it. PCI, if you're a payment processor, SOX if you're public, high trust or HIPAA, if you're maintaining medical records, there's dozens of these. If you look around, if you're operating heavily outside the US, there's about 80 more standards. GDPR is really the center of them, but wherever you're operating, just understand the framework you're in, and that can help you drive your program. Pre-incident and post-incident. This is a really simple concept, but it's worth thinking about. It is much cheaper to solve problems preventatively than it is to recover. So depending on where you are on that arc, you can think about it for your own business. I can give you a very generic set of metrics. Ultimately, it's usually about 1/10 the cost to block something up front than it is at the far end. There's a lot of models for thinking about this. The most common one is called the kill chain, where each step. So we'll talk a little bit before detection and then evaluation, remediation, recovery. Depending on where you are in that, what is the cost and what kind of controls can you put in place? But early, going back to making decisions, if you see risks that are untenable, that are bothersome and they're outside your risk tolerance, fixing them is much cheaper. Even though there can be expense and focus required, it's much cheaper to do that than to have an incident and then try to recover later. Thinking about risk, security is not, in my view, a technology enterprise, right? It's not quite the same as IT. Oftentimes in IT, which is very complicated and very involved, there are many ways to do things, but you have your outcomes defined, and you usually find ways to align your requirements with your outcomes and then build the tool that you're trying to build. In security, the ground can shift under you at a moment's notice, and threats continue to evolve. So I like to see security more as a business function. You're here to help the business run, to survive issues, to reduce risk. You're here to help IT, you're here to help. Thinking about things in the context of risks is really the key. So if you look at risk, low probability, low impact risks, you can make a reasonable decision to not fix those things because it's not that expensive. Perhaps the ultimate result is a few moments of flaky availability for your front end, whatever it is. You define this. But if it's something you think you can manage, you operationally cover it, and it is anything less than cheap in manpower, time, thought, or dollars to fix, you can go ahead and set those things aside. If you think about high probability, low impact, now you're starting to get into a case where the decision tree is a little bit different. It's probably worth fixing those things. Many of you have probably looked into automation, for example, in your IT stack. It's the exact same conversation. What's worth automating and what isn't? Well, it takes me 4 times as long to solve this problem via automation, but the total incidence of that is going to drop to functionally 0, which means over time, we're going to save 5 hours a week. It's the exact same conversation. Can you fix it? What is the likelihood? Is it going to bite you? And what is the cost of that remediation? And in most cases, it's probably worth putting those things on the mid to long-term plan to get them fixed. When you're looking at low probability, high impact risk, things get really tricky. It's easy when you get to the bottom, and it's a critical risk that is very likely to happen. This is what you have to do. Anything you're losing sleep over is a must. It has to be at the top of that list. But when you're looking at things that are high risk but low probability, now maybe solving the problem is not the way to think about it. The way to think about that problem is to address it via mitigation. So mitigation is just polishing the sharp edges off of the problem. Can you reduce the risk by half? Can you reduce the likelihood by half? Implementing some controls. So all these conversations are going to have to happen. The key takeaway, the cost of the mitigation needs to be proportional to the value of your assets. One of my favorite quotes is, if you protect all your diamonds and your paper clips with the exact same controls, you're going to end up with a lot more paper clips than diamonds. You have to look at the value of what you're doing. If it costs an incredible amount of labor or dollars to fix a problem decisively that you think you can live with, and honestly the cost of the risk to you is not that high, you don't have to fix all the security issues. You have to fix the issues that you can't tolerate. Looking at risk mitigation strategies, I have a couple listed here, but ultimately, at this point in the story, you crowdsourced some information about your organization, about risks. You've thought about what your risk tolerance is and what you can and can't live with. Now we're thinking about how to mitigate things. There's a few key mitigations that solve vast amounts of risk. Endpoint security solutions are one of them. Now, I'm not here to self-protect, but you pick a tool, whatever it is. There are many excellent tools. If you're not entirely a Mac shop, if you have a lot of Windows boxes, if you have Linux backends, all these things are achievable. But putting an endpoint security solution in place solves a ton of risk because it gives you visibility and insight into what's happening on your location. Yes, it blocks risks. Yes, it solves for significant classes of vulnerabilities around click-through links or bad phishing automation or malware. But much of the value is you can see things. Thinking about network detection, it's the same story. What you really want there is visibility, because that information correlated with what you know about your endpoints gives you insight into what's happening. Brute force attacks, somebody trying to figure out a password that would allow them into your environment or into your VPN or into your application, it is incredibly common. Not a month goes by where we don't see tens of millions of these sorts of things happening, targeting customer environments all over the place. So the key is being able to see it. Can you see it? Then you can make choices about what you're going to do. Are you going to cut the line? Or are you going to block an IP address? The key to all of it is visibility. Looking at a few other key components, I think that security can be boiled down into really just a few areas. Vulnerability management, configuration management, and identity. So we're talking about identity here. Do you know who has access to your resources? Who can go into the room that contains your treasure? Do you know at any given time that that session is valid? That it didn't last forever? So these are some ways to do it. Access controls, restricting access. The concept of least privilege is any resource in your environment should only be accessible to people who need to have access. That doesn't mean you need to overly restrict it necessarily. Everyone could be in that list of people who need access to something, but understanding and making a choice. We have chosen that in this case, for this intranet web page, everyone can access it. But this accounting system can only be accessed by these 8 people. Making that choice is really critical. Putting those access controls in place would be very helpful. Password policies. Nobody loves passwords. Passwords are reasonably effective. Now, I think that we could go on at length about the technical components of iOS 16 and the move to passkeys and password lists. All that stuff is whiz-bang cool. But ultimately what you need is some gate on how credentials are used and accessed. And it very simply, that can be just strong passwords. Now, security folks spent years and years and years trying to tell people to use funny characters and make everything super complicated to remember. Turned out, my bad, we were totally wrong about that. The only thing that really matters is the length. That is the number one increaser of entropy or increaser of the measurement of difficulty. So if you can make everybody have a 14-character password, if you can encourage them or deliver them some sort of tool that lets them automate a passphrase, super easy to remember, super hard for computers to break. You can worry about all the passwordless future, OAuth, tokens, all those kinds of things down the road. A simple, complicated, complex password that doesn't fall simply to attacks via a dictionary is really helpful. Identity providers. Trusting a vendor to handle a significant portion of this problem for you is a great idea. Okta came on this morning, but there's a lot of identity providers, Google, Amazon, Ping, lots of companies who do this sort of thing. Trusting somebody to help you with your identity, to manage strong passwords, and then allowing you to take that into the single sign-on world where now you know that there aren't discrete credentials for every application, that everything is gated behind an identity provider that's well understood, that's well measured, that lets you terminate a credential, that lets you offboard or onboard people very easily, change who has rights and what, and see everything right in front of you. Auditing. Now we're talking about another step here. Auditing in log data aggregation is putting all your information, your security information in one place. Now, the classic answer to this is the security event management system, the SIEM. I would argue that's not necessary for everyone. You don't need a super complicated aggregator. You need to be able to look in a place to see the information you need to make good choices. So this could be a SIEM, a Splunk, a Datadog. It could also be something like XDR, which would be a platform or endpoint tool would help you correlate that information from other controls. It could be any number of components there, but something where you know that the person responsible for investigating a problem knows where to get the data. Scanning, taking a hard look at your environment, having some tools or even open source components available that let you evaluate your environment against real world threats. This could be a vulnerability scanner, it could be pen testing, it could be any number of things. User training. User training is fantastic. Oftentimes security folks will look at users as the biggest obstacle to security. And ultimately, there's a bit of truth to that. People love to click on stuff. Often that stuff's bad. Don't click on that. Anyway, but really, it's an opportunity. If you build a culture internally where everybody understands, even an inch of security, that everybody understands this idea of risk, and that they have a place and an important opportunity and work obligation to protect themselves and the customers and the business, you're going to get a lot of mileage out of that. Remote access policies, acceptable use. Once you're looking at the policy stack, this is really a piece of the user story. You are telling them clearly what they need to do and expecting them to do it. If it says, don't install Minecraft on your work machine, expect them not to do that. Again, make your choices, but be transparent about it with your users. That would be very helpful. I'm all buttoned up. Anyway. I think we're kind of at the closing anyway here, and I'd like to have some time for questions. But really the story I want to tell you is don't panic about security. It's a huge, snarly issue. You can go 10 miles deep and 10 miles wide both. But think about your business and think about security as an enabler of that business. What is a risk that you can't handle? So document your risks. Find as many people in your organization as possible. Ask them what keeps them up, what they worry about. What news article did you read over the weekend that talks about something that's panic-inducing? Put it all in one place. Get your team together, stack rank it, figure out what's hard and what's easy, what you can tolerate and what you can't, and then start checking them off. Some of that is controls, some of it is training. Find your drivers with compliance and other external things. And ultimately, I'm positive you can all do this. Another thing, I'm going to close on that, is security is a team sport. There is a camaraderie, a community around security that's unlike any other sort of technology or any other sort of business. Nobody competes on security. Now, a lot of people compete on how we implemented this security thing in our product, and it's awesome, and clearly it's the best. That happens all the time. But frankly, nobody's going to hold information back about security, no matter where you go. Peers, competitors, I promise. If you say we have this problem, you will find somebody who will talk to you about that problem in an open and candid way. Find those people you can trust. This is a community effort. Security is a team sport. It's the only way to win. Bad guys have lots of institutional advantages. They have lots of money. They have narrow scope. There's no real consequence to their failure. It's not like that on our side. On our side, there's huge consequences to failure. We have a million things to think about, and it's all really troublesome. So find people you can trust, that you can talk to about security, look to the external community, blogs, all that sort of stuff. Reach out to us, whatever you need. Find some people to talk to you about it. Everybody will be happy to do so. So, I wanted to open it up for or any questions you might have, any topics you want to dig into.
When you think of the recent changes you've made, what has had the most impact?
The most impact. So I think that there's two changes that we made internally that really helped us out. Both were on the user endpoint side. One was we implemented a zero trust model where applications themselves are authenticated to the back end. This takes a huge swath of potential problem out. Now you know that any call to an API or to an internal service, that is the integrity of that communication is really good. I think tying that to conditional access is also really helpful. So you cannot access critical information. You can't access a financial accounting system or a backend cloud resource or hosting provider unless your device is managed by the company, is well understood, that it has trust installed, that it's patched effectively. We always know the state of that endpoint is solid. That really helped us over the last week.
What are you using internally for OS patching?
OS patching. We use Nudge, which is a third party. I'm not endorsing this. We don't own it. We don't have a stake in it. It's just how we do it. There's 100 other ways to do it. But ultimately, the patch comes out. Apple's internal patch management system is great about delivery. Sometimes it's a little sketchy about giving you the information you need to make good decisions. So we have a tool that will pop up in alerts on all these user machines, and it'll just say, click this button when you have time. Tomorrow I'm going to tell you the same thing.
Often the challenge that you have, you brought this up earlier, you have in mind Windows machines.
So you'll have Windows devices and Mac devices. We have a global enterprise environment where we have that, right? We use Intune to manage our Windows devices, and our mobile devices we use Jamf to manage our Mac systems. Now, we could use Intune to manage the Mac systems, but it would suck. So we don't. It's true, and I say this to everyone who sits up here. This is my job, to tell people the strategy where we're going to go. But often, when we're dealing with the ERS team, the Enterprise Risk and Security, I like to explain acronyms if you don't know what they are, they're not commonly used. They'll come up with a product, right? They'll come up, as CrowdStrike as the EDR, even though they're not really using it as an EDR. They'll have CrowdStrike, or they'll use a Zscaler as your zero trust. Even so, these can be challenging on the Mac side because they're generally designed for Windows devices. It's true, they generally are. So, what is your advice toward agreeing that? For me, I think that in an IT organization, if you will think about security and you come up with solutions that are designed for Mac, then you might be able to offset your ERS team and say, hey, we know you want to use this for everything under the sun, but this is more designed for Mac. How do we get that, where we can show the ERS team that these products are the best designed for Mac? Where is there a place to just bring that attention to those things? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. And there's a whole story around this, right? I think that some environments, I'll just say in general terms, it's not always wrong to use one tool for everything. Single pane of glass, even if it's inefficient, maybe that's okay. I would make the argument that in aggregate, you're worse off. CrowdStrike is a great tool, but do you really need 30 million Windows definitions to go through all the time on your Mac device? There's only so many ways for someone to pop a Mac, right, to really cause you trouble. So you need gates on that, and you need somebody who really understands how natively what happens on a Mac, and it's totally different than in Windows, right? So Zscaler is the same story. So I think the story there is that you need parity. So you need your controls to be effective and to meet your requirements. You can't think about the problems and tools problem, because it gets you into a state where you overinvest in tools, or you end up with shelfware that doesn't get implemented or effectively used, right? The story is the requirements. What are the requirements we're looking for? We're looking for anti-malware, we're looking for sandboxing, we're looking for intelligence and telemetry off a device. Well, Does it matter to enterprise risk how you get that? I think the story is there somewhere, right? Ultimately, much of this information is aggregated into a SIM or into some sort of log aggregator, so nobody sees the tool anyway. But you need all the information. What is the information? We need these fields, we need this information, we need these protections. I would really focus on the story around that. Built best, purpose built, means it's going to be lighter weight, often lower cost, often lower difficulties, and it does mean you're going to have two tools and you're going to have to manage that problem, and that's a real problem. But ultimately, for what is likely the same price or lower, you can get better service and better intelligence through a different path. Please. I'm going to keep the question askers as far apart as possible.
Hi. So one thing I think about when it comes to identity providers, especially since Okta went through its own recent security incident, is that a lot of these applications don't support like multiple IPs. And since it's a single point of failure, is there any like movement in the security world to kind of like maybe start supporting multiple IP just in the case of that, like one day that IP does go down? Because that's kind of what came to mind when we talked about it.
Yeah. So ultimately, that seems unlikely. What we will see is collaboration on the margins, right? So Apple's FIDO2 initiative, with Google and Microsoft, is going to provide passkeys that are extensible, and we'll get to a point where your password can be validated in a number of places really seamlessly. But ultimately, there needs to be one authority, one trusted resource for the core of the identity, right? Who is your root domain controller, right? Who is the root of your trust? And you're right, it does pose a vulnerability, it does pose a problem. But having multiple identity providers puts you in a state where you can't always tell who has access to what. In some cases, you end up with foreign security principles that, maybe there's two different ways for you to get a privilege now. I have seen environments that do kind of a customer facing, like an inside out, where they'll have an IDP for their customer facing environment, and they'll have an IDP for their internal environment. Ultimately, it's up to you, but I don't see any reasonable way for you to have redundancy in that system, because one system is always going to hold the core truth. I like it. This is great. Dinner and show.
Hi there. Gartner's recommendation on security has a large focus on privilege management and removing admin rights from endpoints. Apple clearly don't see that. Amos, here you go, here's admin, you should be admin. Where do you see that? If you are with Gartner's side, what are your recommendations towards heading that way, particularly with issues and blockers like security?
This is a fantastic question. This is a hard question, too. Yeah, I love these. These are great. When thinking about local admin rights on a Windows machine, and in fact, in most Linux stacks, your primary mechanism for restricting actions that are bad is credentialing. So you manage the access on the device. You restrict admin so people can't do horrible things, and then that's kind of how you do it. Then you enable it on the user code side. On the Apple side, I think it's a little bit different. The story and the risk calculus is different. Because even as an admin, there's many things you can't reasonably do on a Mac device. And also, you can add control planes over the top of that to give you functionally equivalent restrictions. So I would make the case that you don't have to have a secure environment. But this gets back into the beginning, right? To think about your own business and your own choices and your own risk. Is your risk in your business really underneath your endpoint? I mean, you don't want ransomware to have admin via the local session because in a Windows world, that gives you access to the local environment and lateral movement across, right? So one person clicks on a bad thing and all of a sudden it impacts 100 people. That kind of problem just doesn't exist in the Mac space. Certainly not to that extent. So I think that the combination of the difficulty implementing that effectively and still being able to patch systems and have users install apps, plus the institutional advantages around the native security, and it isn't just the security platform, it's just how the device works, means that the local admin story is, at worst, a lot more complicated, and at best, it's just not the key question. So I think you can reasonably have local admin in an environment and still operate in a secure manner. You layer your controls to make sure your device is trusted, and then your access credentials are effective over the top of it. You're right, though. It's a different conversation. If you're in a Windows shop, there's no argument. You have to get rid of admin because otherwise, functionally, there's just no way to secure that device. Well, you can make an individual Windows device incredibly secure. Yeah. I stand corrected. Yes, absolutely. There are ways to secure all things, but it's quite difficult. Yeah. I can tell you for our story, for many of our users, we allow admin rights, we tie it to conditional access. So we pseudo created our own privilege stack. I didn't mean to be too proud.
I think I know we're right up against the
Yeah.
but I know we started a little bit late too, so maybe there's another burning question that we can
What I'll say is, we're all friends here. Security at JNUC is an email address, it gets to us. If you have questions, we're not limited to this event or this session. Feel free to reach out, whatever you can help.
Started off with